welcome to another episode of the Sfarim Chatter podcast. I'm Nachi Weinstein. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by Tehillah Monveil. This episode of the podcast is about the making of the Siddur, how the tefillahs we say every day came together and became such a central part of Jewish life. And if you enjoy thinking about the Siddur in this way, there's a podcast worth checking out called Tehillah Unveiled. Tehillah Unveiled, hosted by Ari Levison, opens up the chapters of Tehillah we've been saying our whole lives and shows us the story behind the story. Our recent episode looks at L'chun Ranana, the Mizmor we say at the beginning of Kabbalah Shabbos. It starts off so beautifully, Come let us sing to Hashem, but by the end it takes a surprisingly dark turn, talking about Meriva, Masa, and the generation of the wilderness that was barred from entering the land. So what is going on? Why does this Mizmor move from song to failure, and why is that the chapter that we use to begin Shabbos? You can find out more by listening to Tehillah Unveiled. Search for Tehillah Unveiled wherever you listen to podcasts or click on the link in the show notes. To sponsor an episode or to support the podcast, please email me sfarimchatter@gmail.com, or you can find the link and information in the show notes. You can also find a link to join the Sfarim Chatter WhatsApp community where I post new books, new Sfarim, book deals, and more, as well as a link to the Sfarim Chatter WhatsApp status if you prefer status to WhatsApp community. And finally, if you can please subscribe to the podcast wherever it is that you listen to the podcast, and if you can rate and review the podcast if you use Apple. And finally, enjoy this episode about the sources of the Siddur and about the Siddur and davening. This is the first episode. The second episode in this two-part episode, if you will be later this week. So enjoy the episode. Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of the Sfarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined once again by Rabbi Moshe Walter, who is the Rav of Woodside Synagogue Avos Torah in Silver Spring, Maryland, and is the Executive Director of the Rabbinical Council of Greater Washington. And last time Rabbi Walter was on the podcast was focused on the making of the Siddur, which was his newest book, The History, Development, and Halachas of the Siddur, published by Feldheim. And on that episode, we mentioned that for those interested, we are happy to do something a little bit more in depth. That was more of a broader view of Siddur and Nusach and the history and development of the Siddur. And we focused on some examples specifically on Tishrei, and that's when we recorded it and it was released then. But I mentioned this. So a listener reached out that he was interested and generous enough to sponsor this and the next episode. There are two episodes related to this topic. I want to start off right away that this episode of the podcast is sponsored by Mordechai and Michal Newman in memory of their parents, Shimon ben Michal, Rachel bas Avram, and David ben Shmuel, and Sarah Mindel bas Pesachia, and their Neshama Shem and Aliyah. And that's how this came to be, really, from that comment, and then talked to Rabbi Walter, and we decided to do this. So this episode, at least to start this one, and again, there will be two, we'll call it a mini-series, or a long episode, if you will be focused on the making of the Siddur, but going through davening, daily, weekly, Shabbos, we're going to try to, well, not so much, but we'll try to walk through somewhat the history and development of each tefillah. So thank you, Rabbi Walter, for joining me once again.
Thank you, Nachi. Great to be back with you. Looking forward.
Okay, so I'll turn it over to you. Where do you want to start? What's the best place to start when we start off something like this? And again, obviously, the general overview and nusach and so on and so forth, refer back to that first episode. Go listen to that general one. I'll link to that episode in the show notes. Listen to that one. We're not going to start there, but where should we start?
So your question is a good way to start. I think what I've learned and what we're hearing is that people are certainly interested in understanding the depth of the Siddur, certainly the Makairis, the origin, and the breakdown of the Siddur. I think many people have been quite surprised to see and to learn and understand the complexity of the Siddur and the enormous amount of time that the Siddur was written and put together over, and the amount of different individuals who were involved in sort of composing and writing what we hold in our hands today as the Siddur. I think a good way to start is really to sort of create a structure to the Tefillah and to the Siddur. I speak about this a bit in the introduction to the book, but let me put this down because I think this is critical in terms of people appreciating what we're doing when we daven, how we daven, and what is made up of the Siddur. The basis of my comments now are really from Reb Chaim Vital, the outstanding disciple of the Arizal. As you're mostly aware, never wrote anything. The Arizal didn't leave behind any ksavim. His student Reb Chaim Vital is his outstanding disciple. His Talmud Mufak really wrote over everything that he heard from the Arizal, and we have a lot from the Arizal in Tefillah. And Reb Chaim Vital put that in several places, but most prominently in a sefer called Pri Etz Chaim. And in a section called Shar HaTefillah, so he says, and he writes the following from the Arizal. And that is, if you look at the Siddur, and if you look at the Tefillos, they could really be broken down into four different components chronologically. We start when we open the Siddur by Shachris with Berchas HaShachar, Karbanos, that whole first section of the Siddur is really stop number one, or what we would call, let's say, first base. And there the focus is on brachos, and is on thanking Hashem, appreciating what Hashem has given us. Malbish Harumim, Matir Asurim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu has given us, has provided us with all of the needs and necessities that we have in Olam Hazeh. That's section number one. So really from Moda'ani until Rabbi Shmuel Omer is section number one. And that's all of brachos, that's Olam Hazeh, that's all focusing on our needs, and those are the Berachas HaShachar that we really make. Section number two is Pesukei Zimra. Focus of Pesukei Zimra is stage two, which is the cosmos, the upper world, the sun, the moon, the stars, and the world of the Bari Olam. And of course, Pesukei Zimra focuses heavily on that, and talks about the stars, and the moon, and the sun, and the cosmos, and the Yam, and all of the different beautiful creations of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So we move from this world, from Olam Hazeh, from our needs, to the world of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to the creations of God, to the world of the cosmos, and to the world of the sun and the moon and the stars. And that's why we praise and we energize this space in Pesukei Zimra. Section number three, or point number three, is Shema, and Berachos Kriya Shema. And it's in that section that we really begin to correspond not to Olam Hazeh, not to the world of the cosmos, but to another higher world, and that's the world of the angels. And therefore we refer to the angels in this section of Tefillah, and Berachos Kriya Shema, Srafim, Ofanim, Chayos HaKodesh, Kadosh, 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 Baruch Kvod Hashem Mekamo. We've entered the Olam and the Olamos of the Elyonim, the world of the angels. That's Kriya Shema and Berachos Kriya Shema. Then we enter the highest of all worlds, the fourth section of Tefillah, which is Tefillah itself, and that's Shemona Esrei, and that's when we're Omed Lifnei Melech. We are now at this point, after these three stages of Tefillah, of the Siddur, we're prepared to encounter our Creator, to be Omed Lifnei Melech, and to address HaKadosh Baruch Hu directly. This is the way that Reb Chaim Vital expresses and articulates how the Siddur is really put forth and how it's articulated, how it's set up. Interestingly enough, if you take a look, also not only in the Svarim of the Mekubalim, but also the Poskim, there's a Tshuva of the Maram Shek quoting from the Chassam Sofer, it's in the Chayadim, it's in the Aruch HaShulchan. The Gedolei Poskim also begin to express this structure, these four stages, from Birchas HaShachar to Pesukei Zimra to Birchas Kriya Shema and Kriya Shema until Tefillah. And it has a very critical element in the Siddur itself. You'll take a look, and I don't know if many of your listeners will notice this, but you'll see in each section the pasuk Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad is found. In the first section, we say in Mekadesh Shimcha Barabim, we say Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. The second section, after Az Yashir, there is many Siddurim that put Uvisorascha Kasav Lemor, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. The third section, of course, has Shema, and if you take a look in the fourth section, the final section, after Aleinu, you'll also again see Visorascha Kasav Lemor, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. This has been brought by the Mekubalim. I don't believe everybody says it, but in most Siddurim, they will source this from either the Pri Etz Chaim, from the Chassam Sofer, from his student, from the Maram Shek, and the Chayadim, the Aruch HaShulchan, all speak about these four sections, and in each section, we're being miyached Shem Hashem, we're being miyached HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And it's for that reason that you'll see in your Siddur, many Siddurim, some Siddurim will have it, some Siddurim won't have it, that this pasuk, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Echad, is really the essential pasuk, the critical pasuk, and it speaks to each of these four sections. That's what the Mekubalim say. The Balei Halacha point out that you have to daven in this Seder. And this you'll find in Shulchan Aruch and Simanun Aleph, and it really expresses itself also in the Arizal, Talmid Arizal, whether or not you should skip certain sections. Chalila, nobody should come late to shul, right? But it happens. And the question is, where should I go? Should I start by Vayishtabach? Should I start with Berachos Kriya Shema? Should I start with Karbanos and Pesukei Zimra? Should I go in order? Should I not go in order? And the Mekubalim speak a lot about being Mahapech the Yotzos and being Mahapech Tzinoros, and not really saying things Kiseder Hadvarim, the way that the Siddur was meant to be established. And therefore you see how the Kabbalah and Halach are sort of two halves of the same coin, that there needs to be a Seder HaTfilah. And we'll see that later when we talk about Mincha and Ma'ariv, the same idea that there needs to be a direction, there's a chronology, there is a method to the complexity and to the madness of the Siddur, where there are building blocks and rungs on a ladder that are being developed. And then the question becomes, where you don't have enough time, or things have to be skipped, or you're in a compromised situation, should one skip? How should one skip? And that's really not to be lechatchila. We begin to find differences amongst the Litvaks and amongst the Hasidim. Should one skip? Should one skip? Let's say you're coming late, how to handle that. That's all really based upon this chronology.
Okay, so we should start at the beginning of davening, and we'll just work our way through davening. Now, obviously, in the beginning, we're not going to go through every little thing right in the beginning. You have Moed Ani, and then you have all the beginning stuff, and Berachos Tefillin, and so on. But let's start in the beginning with Adon Olam, Matoivu Yigdal, and so on.
Adon Olam is a great place to start, and there's actually quite a lot of discussion in rabbinic literature and the poskim about why the Siddur really opens with Adon Olam. If you take a look in the Siddur, the first page basically that you open is Adon Olam. Certainly there Berachos Tefillin, Berachos Tzitzis, etc., before, but Adon Olam really begins what we know as the Siddur. But let me start with a very interesting anecdote, and I think people will find this to be fascinating. I was researching Adon Olam and trying to get to the bottom of the authorship of Adon Olam. And there is a lot of discussion about who was the author of Adon Olam. Till today, probably we can't with certainty pin the exact author. If you take a look in the Yotzei Tefillos and Rabbi Yaakov Emden, Siddur Beis Yaakov, so most understand that it seems to be the great poet Paitan, Rabbi Shlomo ben Gamliel. He is likely the most fitting candidate to be the author. If you take a look in the Likutei Marech is a very important sefer halacha, minig, B'Yisrael Chaim Friedman of Hungarian origin, and in his sefer he writes, the author of Adon Olam was none other than Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Now, I saw this early on in my research, and I was mishtaimim, like Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. How could that be? How's that feasible? How's that possible? If you look in the Likutei Marech, he says that he found this in a source called the Sefer Atchiyah. Sefer Atchiyah is a very fascinating, uncommonly used work in Sefer. I went to the Sefer Atchiyah to look in the Sefer Atchiyah to see what he says about this. And lo and behold, I went through the entire Sefer, and I did not find that at all. It doesn't say that. There's nowhere in the Sefer Atchiyah that it says that the author of Adon Olam was Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Lo hadam, lo hayad dvar milom. It doesn't exist. So I started to look more and more, and after I began my research, I started seeing that all the Sfarim quote that the author of Adon Olam is none other than Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and the source is Likutei Marech. I said it's not true. It's not feasible. It's not possible. There was a recently printed sefer Likutei Marech, Rabbi Margaretin, I believe was his name, and I went to the recently annotated Likutei Marech, and I did not find that line. It doesn't say that. In the newly printed Likutei Marech, roughly 10 years ago, it doesn't say that. In the old Likutei Marech, it does say that. So I called the author who put out the new Likutei Marech, and I said, what's going on here? This is a terrible error. The Likutei Marech never wrote this. In the early Sfarim, it says, Likutei Marech says, quotes the Sefer Atchiyah, that the author was Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. You can't find it in the Sefer Atchiyah, and you took it out. Why'd you take it out? So he told me he had access to the earliest manuscripts of Likutei Marech, which are in his possession. And in the earliest manuscripts of Likutei Marech, it says that the author of Adon Olam was indeed Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, according to the Sefer Atchiyah, but Rabbi Chaim Friedman, the author of Likutei Marech, scribbled over it. He scribbled over it, clearly noting that it's an error, that's a mistake. All the printings of Likutei Marech printed that the author of the Likutei Marech, of the Adon Olam was the Likutei Marech, saying that it was from Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and that was a terrible error. And that error crept into almost every sefer that deals with Adon Olam. So I just want to point out that very often you have this issue, certainly in the Siddur, that people will say somebody wrote something or they will reference something, and it's all in error because one person made a mistake and everybody copied the same mistake. So Baruch Hashem, I was able to get to the bottom of this issue, and I'm proud that I was able to clarify and rectify. There's absolutely no source at all to the fact that Adon Olam was written by Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. There's no such thing. And even though it's true in Likutei Marech, in the original print, he did have that, it was canceled, it was erased, it was scribbled over, and ultimately in the currently printed Likutei Marech, that error has been fixed. So therefore, the authorship of Adon Olam is critical, is important, and most likely, as I pointed out, it's from Geonim or it's from Rabbi Shlomo ben Gamliel. There's a fascinating citation of the Mateh Moshe. The Mateh Moshe was a Talmud of the Marshal, a very important sefer halacha. He also brings a lot of philosophy, Kabbalah, explanation for halacha, and he has a lot on the Siddur. And there he quotes a very important statement. I think he's the originator of it, that anybody who says Adon Olam with Kavana, Reb Shira Gaon, Reb Hai Gaon, will be arevim. They'll be guarantors that your tefillos will be accepted. That's what the Mateh Moshe writes. Many people quote this Mateh Moshe, and it's for that reason that I would surmise that the tefillah, the piyut of Adon Olam, is found at the beginning. Because if you say Adon Olam, your tefillah is guaranteed to be answered. That would be my understanding explanation. That's number one. Number two, I'll share with you a fascinating anecdote from the Gaon, from Rabbi Leo Kramer, the Vilna Gaon. He had a sefer that was brought to him for a haskama. As far as I'm aware, the Vilna Gaon only wrote actually 2 haskamas in his lifetime, but a sefer was brought to him, and he found the following explanation written by the Mechaber why Adon Olam is the first tefillah that we find in the Siddur. And the Mechaber writes that because the Gemara says in Brachos Tav Zayin that Avram Avinu was the first person to ever call HaKadosh Baruch Hu Adon, and since Avram Avinu was the Misaken, he enacted Tefillah Shachris, therefore the first Tefillah we put in to thank Avram Avinu for being Misaken Shachris and for referring to Kadosh Baruch Hu as Adon is Adon Olam. That's the word. When the Gra saw the Sefer and read the Sefer, he was Mishabeach this Pshat in Adon Olam, and he said the whole Sefer is worthwhile just for this Pshat. So there's a lot of discussion regarding this anecdote and this story. You could take a look in the Sefer. I referenced many of the Marmakomas regarding this anecdote and the story. But this story really does explain the reason, at least according to the Vilna Gaon, why Adon Olam is found at the beginning. So clearly, Adon Olam is a critical piyut. Amazingly and interestingly enough, I would imagine that post people do not recite Adon Olam at the beginning. And if anything, they probably say it at the end of davening. If you want, we could talk about that now. We could talk about that later. But certainly Adon Olam's popularity is less in the beginning of the Siddur and actually more at the end of the Siddur. Many Kihilas recite Adon Olam either at the end of davening, on Shabbos, on Yontif. Mata Moshe writes that Dafkut should be said before Shachris on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. That's what he says, and many have that nusach as well. That's what the Maharil seem to have indicated was the right thing to do, only on Yom Kippur. But nonetheless, Adon Olam certainly gets to the core and to the yesod of Tefillah. Adon Olam Asher Malach B'Terem Kol Yitzir Never. We want to begin our Tefillah recognizing who we are davening to. Who is HaKadosh Baruch Hu? What is HaKadosh Baruch Hu? HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the Adon Olam. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the master of the world. He's all powerful. He has all the kochos, Baal kochos. It speaks to what Shem Hashem is, how we teach and explain what Yud Kei Vav Kei is, and therefore Adon Olam would seem to be the most critical tefillah to begin the Siddur with. It was widely accepted, as opposed to Yigdal, which we probably won't have enough time to talk about. Yigdal's a lot of polemics regarding the recitation of Yigdal. That Rizal was staunchly opposed to the recitation of Yigdal. Yigdal also got into the Siddur and is widely accepted as well, but certainly Adon Olam did not have the same level of controversy regarding its recitation as opposed to Yigdal. And Adon Olam certainly is a very powerful way to start the Siddur, and as we'll see momentarily, also a very powerful way to conclude Tefillah as well.
As you mentioned, Yigdal and also Matoivu. Those are the 3, I guess, in the beginning. Okay, let's turn to Birchas HaShachar.
The Birchas HaShachar is important for multiple reasons. Number one, it's because we have a Makor in Shas. We have a Makor in Chazal. The Gemaras in the end of Maseches Brachos, Perek HaRoah, refer to the brachos that we say every single day. Shlos ani goy, shlos ani yavet, shlos ani isha, nos nesachet bin alavchim ben yavan laila. The Gemara brachos is very clear and very exacting as to those brachos, and that should be said. So therefore, that's a reference that we know that the Gemara says Mesachos Megillah, brachos, tfilos, kedushos, avodalos were all established by the Anshe Knesset Hagdolos. So people have to know and understand when you're making Birchas HaShachar, and really all brachos, we'll get to it in Birchas Kuyishma as well, those brachos were established by the Anshe Knesset Hagdolos. That's clear. So therefore, we have a makor, we have a place, we have a source for Birchas HaShachar. What is interesting about Birchas HaShachar is that there's several brachos that we don't find in the Gemara that you will find in the Siddur. I do want to point out that the Mechaber says in Shulchan Aruch and Simon Memvav and Orchaim, Yesh nogin levarach brachos acheros nosafos aleilu v'tosu biyadam. There were those communities that had a custom to recite other Birchas HaShachar, and says the Mechaber that's a tos. And the reason that it's a tos, the Gra explains in Biur Gra, we don't recite any brachos that were not concretized by Chazal, by Anshe Knesset and Shas. There's a Rush, a Chuvas Rush, the Rush in Psakim, in several places in Shas speaks about this. Any bracha that was not ratified by Anshe Knesset Hagdolah or by the Talmud, by Chazal, does not have a place to be said, and that's what the Mechaber says, Tosu biyadam. What the Mechaber is referring to, that there were certain communities that made a bracha of Somech Noflim and Magbia Shvalim. Those brachas are not well known, but the Beis Yosef brings them, the Torah refers to them, and says the Mechaber we don't say them. So we won't find them in Eidni Siddur as far as I'm aware, not in Sfard and not in Ashkenaz. Then the Mechaber says the following thing, again in Simon Memvav, Yesh nogin levarach hanosen li'av koach. There are certain customs amongst communities that you make the bracha nosin liyav koach, that we should have strength, we should have koach during the day, and then the Mechaber concludes, ve'in divrei nurim. We don't say that bracha. So that means the Mechaber says that we do not recite the bracha of nosin liyav koach. And then the Ramah concludes and says, ach, a minhag pasha b'vnei Ashkenazim l'amra. Minhag Ashkenaz is to recite nosin liyav koach. Whoa! All of a sudden, good morning America, we have a major machlokas Mechaber and the Ramah, machlokas Sfaradim and Ashkenazim. Should the bracha nosin liyav koach be recited or not? Mechaber says not, and the Ramah says it should. What is the nekudas of machlokas? What's the point of contention as to whether or not this bracha should be recited? If any listener opens up their siddur, everybody will see that that bracha is found in the siddur. What are they arguing about? So the Vilna Gaon explains that they're arguing about a very basic principle. The Mechaber is l'shitase. The Mechaber, the Shulchan Aruch, Yosef Karo, is positing that any bracha that's not found in Shas should not be recited. And therefore, just like Magbiya Shvalim, Somech Noflim, any bracha that's not found in Shas should not be recited. Hanosin layav koach is not found in Maseches Brachos. It's not found in Perek Aron. Therefore, it shouldn't be recited. The Ramah, however, the way the Vilna Gaon explains, is that minhag oker halacha. That there's certain times where customs will trump the halachic truth. And therefore, since the bracha of Anosin Le'av Koch was accepted customarily to be recited, therefore it should be recited. And this bracha became one of the 18 brachos that we recite every single morning in Berachas HaShachar, and we recite it, and it's said with Shema Malchus, and comfortably, strongly, and very passionately, very appropriately. But this again gets to the heart and to the core of the Siddur and to brachos in general. What makes it into the Siddur? What doesn't make it into the Siddur? What's the license for something to be printed or not to be printed? Should we say it? Should we not say it? So the Mechaber says, no, it has no place in Shas. It's not found in Chazal. It's not found in the Gemara, so therefore don't say it. On the other hand, the Vilna Gaon explains that the reason that we as Ashkenazim say this bracha is simply because it's a minhag, and a strong minhag for hundreds, thousands of years, and therefore it should be recited. The same thing is true with another very important bracha, and that's the bracha of Shasani Kirtzono. Women make the bracha. Of course, they're not going to make the bracha Shalo Asani Isha. They can make the bracha Shasani Kirtzono. Mechaber brings that. Asks the Gra, why and how could you say that bracha? It's not found in Shas. And the Mechaber himself, who says not to say Hanosen Le'yav Koach, because it's not found in Shas, posits and prints and articulates and paskins that you should make the bracha of Shasani Kirtzono as a woman. So the Gra explains again, strong minhag, and minhag mevatel halacha, minhag oker halacha, and since women were making this bracha, it can be recited. And then the Vilna Gaon says there is a precedent for it in Tanakh, and it's a pasuk in the Navi Yonah, Sha'asa Kiritzono, and therefore the Vilna Gaon says it doesn't have a makor, it has a makor in Tanakh, and therefore it can and should be recited. So therefore in Birchas HaShachar, it's critical to be aware and to be familiar, and this is what we speak about quite a bit in that chapter, is being aware of the brachos that are being recited, what the source of them are, where they came from, why they can be said, and recognizing that when those brachos are being made, we're making a bracha that the Anshe HaKnesses Agdol Mesakin, Ezra HaSofer. Very often everybody thinks that all of Tefillah was initiated by the Anshe Knesses Agdola. That's obviously false. But clearly brachos, tefillos, kedushos, ve'havdalos, that refers to Shemon Esrei as well. But certainly these brachos are part and parcel of the enactment of Anshe Knesses Agdola. And therefore, between Bayis Rishon and Bayis Sheni, these were established. When we're making these brachos, we should recognize that we are tapping into the nusach of the great holy Anshe Knesses Agdola. And that's the brachos that we say. And these are the reason that we say them, and these extra brachos as well, how they made it in, why they made it in, and the strength really of those brachos as well.
We aren't discussing all the brachos because obviously that would be even longer than 2 episodes if we went through every single one. So that's first of all. Also, you're focusing on, like we did in the last, like the overall episode, you're focusing on, again, Nusach Ashkenaz and Nusach, you say Tzfar, you're talking about Mizrach. There obviously are many differences, and not every Sephardi community is the same. In the same way, not every Ashkenaz community is exactly the same. Even in Germany, even between Ashkenaz, then you have Nosach Sfard and etc. The many different variations. So we're just sticking to the general broad themes here, because obviously, if we start going down there's different variations. Now, even though
people should be familiar to take a look in the book, in their the sources, the materials, the footnotes all address many of those distinctions and complexities between different nuschos.
Correct. Now, one thing to mention about, it could be we mentioned this in the last episode about the structure of the brachas, is that, and so this has to do with just Siddurim, as you mentioned before. Some Siddurim or quotations, you see one thing is quoted when you look at the sources, even sometimes you find this in Siddurim, is that ideally is what an halacha that the structure Asher Yatzar should come before Lekai Neshama. So it's Lekai Neshama is bookended with a bracha in the beginning and a bracha at the end. Not all Siddurim have it like that. I think many Siddurim have changed to that, but that's one thing. So I don't know if that's something you get into, how the structure of where things should be put in the Siddur. And sometimes that's just how the printers put things.
Absolutely. We did talk about that on the last podcast, and I encourage people to listen there. And we focused a bit about the power of the publishers and the power of the printing homes, and how much influence really the publishers and the printers, many of them actually not Jewish, had. And that's the reason why many Gedolei Yisrael, the Shai Ephraim, Rav Zalman Margolis writes this, the Aruch HaShulchan, Michael Epstein writes this. Every Siddur needs a rabbi or a rabbinic board for oversight and for approbation. And that's the reason that many of the wonderful Siddurim that we have today, the contemporary Siddurim that we have today, are so outstanding because of the fact that they've been worked through by Torah scholars, by Talmidei Chachamim, and there's significant scholarship that's went into it, working through halacha, minhag, Kabbalah, and philosophy, and making sure that that's all the case. And if you take a look at more of the contemporary Siddurim, the point that you just made, Nachi, for sure is accurate, that's the reason that we're seeing significant changes. Another interesting change that people might not be aware of, and it's critical to be familiar with this, it's so fascinating. Old Siddurim, I'm talking about the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, they just had the prayers. They just had the tefillos. We take for granted that today's Siddurim tell us what to say, when to say, how to say. If you forgot to say it, they have halachas in the back. Just think for a moment. If you lived 100 years ago and you opened up a siddur, if you weren't a Talmud Chacham, you would be lost. What happens if I make a mistake? Hamelach HaKadosh, Hakel HaKadosh. Do I say it? When do I say it? How do I say it? It's unbelievable how advanced our Siddurim have become to clarify and to crystallize what should be said, when it should be said, how it should be said. That's certainly not the way the old Siddurim looked at all. And therefore, we have a lot to be thankful and grateful for, that the printers of the recent 50 years and even 100 years have done a really marvelous job working with scholars and Rabbanim and Talmidei Chacham and experts in the Siddur and halachas to make sure that we are appropriately saying the tefillos that we're supposed to be saying, and that's led to a certain level of machlokas debate, what makes it in and what doesn't make it in, right? We talked about this, I think, last time. Certain tefillos we removed because they probably snuck in at a certain point without a rabbinic oversight and approbation. And yes, there's certainly so much to talk about in that regard as well.
Before we get to Pesukei Zimra, which is a very important topic, anything to say on Karbanos?
So Karbanos are interesting, mostly because people skip them. If you look in the Shulchan Aruch doesn't really require or obligate it. In Siman Aleph, the Shulchan Aruch does require a little bit later, Siman Mem Vav, two Karbanos, Karban HaTamid and Parshas HaTamid should be recited. If there's time, we could talk about Mincha, why we don't say Parshas HaTamid when we should say Parshas HaTamid. But Rabbi Shmuel should be recited. It's not Karbanos and Ezra Mukoman. Those are the three that seem to be most required in the poskim. The reason for the Karbanos found in the Siddur is because Neshama Parm Sfasenu. All of Tefillah was patterned and duplicated based upon the Karbanos that we had, and therefore the recitation of Karbanos is ordered to bring out and to concretize and to appreciate what we're doing, and that the Karban, the psukim that we're saying, should have the power, the potency of the Karban itself. Of course, Tefillah is critical, and Tefillah is important, and Avodah Shabalev is awesome, but it's not what existed Bisman Shabbeis Mikdash Haikam. Yes, certainly there were tefillos associated with the Karbanos, but now all we have is just the tefillos. As we'll see momentarily when it comes to Pesukei Zimra, there's a significant discussion regarding the tefillos that we say in Pesukei Zimra and the relationship to Karbanos. We'll get to it in a moment regarding Hodu. But again, it's a time factor. And the question always is, as the Mechaber says, Tov me'at bekavana, meharbe below kavana. It's a Mechaber in Siman Aleph and Orach Chaim. And that's very much part of the ruach of the Siddur. You could really daven all day, right? And that's Rabbi Yochanan says, Adam Kula. It's impossible. So therefore, we need to know what to focus on, what we can say, how we can say it, to say it with Kavanah, and certainly that's very much part of our discussion momentarily in Pesukei Zimra. But Karbanos, again, it's not a requirement. It's not obligatory. Parshas Tamid is more so obligatory, as the Mechaber says. And if a person has more time, Tov. That's the language of the Shulchan Aruch. Tov. It's a good thing to say. If you have time to say Pita Bakteris, if you have time to say Other areas, the carbanola, etc., etc., etc. Wonderful, matov manaim. But a person needs to balance and know what to focus on. You could open up the Siddur and not stop. So therefore, that's a little bit of a feel in terms of how people should approach davening, how should they approach the Siddur, balancing what and how and time should be said.
Psukkah de Zimra, as you said, where does it even start with?
Yeah, Psukkah de Zimra is really a great case study in the Siddur. Because of course, those words, let's just start with that. We use those words colloquially, contemporarily, Psukkah de Zimra. If you take a look in Shas and Rishonim, to my knowledge, you will not find those words. You're not going to find that. You'll find them more 300, 400, 500 years ago. I think the Levush, the Moshe already referred to those words, Psukkah de Zimra. Psukkah de Zimra literally means verses, psukim of Zemer, of praise of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. In Shas, you don't see anything about quote unquote Psukkah de Zimra. What you do see several quotes, it's Gemara Shabbos, Gemara Brachos, Gemara Megillah, is that we should be Mishabeach HaKadosh Baruch Hu first before Tefillah. And that's really what Tefillah is, that we should praise HaKadosh Baruch Hu before being mevakesh and requesting our needs. It wouldn't be appropriate just to go to the king and to ask before praising the king. So that's really what Psukkah de Zimra is all about. And therefore, what the Gemara does say is that should be said. The quandary that we're left in is, what do I say? It's not found in Shas. Shas doesn't say what to say, which psukim, which prakim. You're not going to find that anywhere. And if you take a look, this is a major machlokas Shana. I call it, and I refer to it in the Sefer, as a machlokas, the Rif and Rashi. And siding with the Rif is the Rambam and the Rosh, that Psukkah de Zimra is essentially what we call Ashrei, or what the Gemara refers to as Tefillah LeDavid. And that is the ultimate focus of all of Psukkah de Zimra. That's the highlight, that's the high point. If Shemona Esrei is the highlight and high point of all of Tefillah, Ashrei is the apex, the climax of all of Psukkah de Zimra. And the Gemara says very clearly, it's in Gemara Maseches Brachos, elsewhere, that a person should say Tefillah LeDavid, and anybody who does say Tefillah LeDavid regularly is a Ben Olam Haba. It's a question of Nuschos and Gersos. Is it 1 time a day? Is it 3 times a day? But nonetheless, Tefillah LeDavid is the most critical component. So the Rif says you must say Ashrei, what we call Ashrei. That first pasuk Ashrei was added later. Take a look in the Sefer. We talk about when and why and where. But Tefillah LeDavid, Perek, Kuf, Mem Hey in Tehillim is the critical component. So the Rif says, once you're saying Per Kuf Mem Hey, finish off Tehillim and say Kuf Mem Vav, Kuf Mem Zayin, Kuf Mem Ches, Kuf Mem Tes, and Kuf Nun. And therefore, those are all the halalukas that are found after Ashrei. So the Rif's Psukkah de Zimra is essentially Ashrei and the latter 5 chapters of Tehillim, getting us from Per Kuf Mem Hey to Kuf Nun, 6 full chapters of Tehillim. That is what the Rif requires, along with the Bracha Rishona and Bracha Achrona. The Bracha Rishona is Baruch Shamar, the Bracha Achrona is Yishtabach. That is the Rif's Psukkah de Zimra. So if you're living Bizman HaGaonim, and you're a Talmud of the Rif, and the Rambam codifies this, and the Rosh codifies this, that's what Shmones, that's what Psukkah de Zimra looked like. A very simple Baruch Shamar in the beginning, Yishtabach at the end, and from Ashrei and all of the latter 5 Halalukas, that is the full Psukkah de Zimra. Rashi disagrees, and Rashi in Masechah Shabbos on this comment of the Gemara that you should say Psukkah Zimra on a daily level, on a daily routine, schedule, chronology prior to Tefillah, says, no. All you have to say is the 3rd and the 5th of the Halalukas. That's all you need to say. So you have a very basic machlokas, Rashi and the Rif, as to whether or not you have to say all 5 Halalukas plus Ashrei, or like Rashi, just Ashrei and Perik, the 3rd and the 5th of those Halalukas. What the basis is the machlokas, the point of contention, I talk about in the Siddur, there's a Sfas Emes about it, and others try to explain what they're basing their argument about, why the latter 5 or why those 3, but let us appreciate for a moment and pause that for a very long time in Jewish history, that's all Psukkah de Zimra was. Psukkah de Zimra was Baruch Shamar in the beginning, Yishtabach at the end, and either Ashrei in the last 5 Halalukas or Ashrei and Halaluka number 3 and 5. Zeh. That's it. Several hundred years later, there became what we call Hodu. And Hodu became a major debate. Should it be recited, should not be recited? Psukim from Divrei Hayamim. And Hodu also already existed later in the times of the Rishonim, but with the Rishonim debate, and this many people aren't aware of, they think that this is only a later debate in the 1700s, the Rishonim already debate whether or not Hodu should be recited before Baruch Shamar or after Baruch Shamar. And what is that debate about? Exactly the question you asked me earlier, Nachi. The psukim of Hodu actually were recited in conjunction and in correlation with Karbanos. So therefore, many of the Rishonim said, if that's the psukim that are reciting with Karbanos, say it right after Karbanos before Baruch Shemer, because it should be part of the Karbanos section. Other Rishonim understand Pum Fakir. No. This is a continual way to praise HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We want to praise Hashem more. So if it's part of praising Hashem, then say Baruch Shamar. That should be the matir. That should be the license for the Psukei de Zimra. And then say Hodu. That's the debate that the Rishonim had. So Hodu made it in. The only question was when. Before Baruch Shamar, after Baruch Shamar. But this machlokus became more pronounced in the 1700s. And this was obviously the very, very significant machlokus between Misnagdim and Chasidim. And this began the debate between what we call Nusach Ashkenaz and Nusach Sfard, and tremendous significant polemics and written debates, tshuvas, the Devrei Chaim, the Chassam Sofer, the Maram Shik, etc., the Munkachirav, all weighed in on where Hodu belongs. Nusach Ashkenaz classically placed it after Baruch Shemer because that's the way many Rishonim understood, that it's part of blessing, praising Hashem, so therefore Baruch Shamar, and then more praise of Hashem. Nusach Sfard actually understood for Kabbalistic reasons, and this you look in the Chassam Sofer and the Maram Shek, you look in the Devrei Chaim, and you look in the Munkacher, become a Kabbalistic debate, and the Mekubalim, and certainly influenced the Hasidim and the great Hasidic masters and the houses of Hasidus, and therefore they placed Nusach Sfard, and this was one of the great debates. This was one of the central debates regarding Nusach Sfard, is the placement of Hodu prior to Baruch Shamar. So that it begins to express a longer, more established Psukei de Zimra. So we begin with Ashrei and the latter Halalukas, and then you move to Hodu. The only question is before Baruch Shamar or after Baruch Shamar. The next stage of development of Psukei de Zimra became what we call the Psukei Zimra, Az Yashir, V'charsim Abris, and then Mizmor Lasoda and Mizmor Shechanukas Habayis L'Daven. And essentially those were added because it's more Psukei de Zimra. It's more Zemra. Mizmor Lasoda, Shulchan Aruch, it says, should be recited with song. I don't know if most shuls do that. Most of us don't do that, but it should be recited b'zimra. Az Yashir also, the poskim say, should be recited with great joy and simcha. So these were added later again in order that there should be a more of an expression of praise to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The most contentious of these later debates was actually Mizmor Shir Chanukas Habayis L'Daven. The Vilna Gaon was a staunch opponent, and if you look in the Siddur HaGra, we talked about that last time, what the Siddur HaGra is. The Gra Talmidav were very opposed to the recitation of Mizmor Shir because we don't add to the Siddur. There should never be any kapitel tilim that's added that was not either sanctified by Chazal, by Anshe Knesset Zagdola, by Rabbi Lazar Kalir, and anything else should not be added, and therefore the Vilna Gaon was a staunch opponent. Reb Shimon Schwab also says that the old German custom, and this is true in Adas Yeshurun and Breuers, etc., that the old German custom was also not to recite Mizmor Shir Chanukas Habayis L'Daven for the very reason that it's not a tefillah, it's not a mizmor that was ever placed as part of the original Psukei de Zimra, the Siddur. So here in a very a short nugget and in a short soundbite, I'm really sharing the development of Psukei de Zimra, which really gets the guts and the heart of the development of the Siddur, and we're watching over hundreds of years that the Siddur that we're holding and the Psukei de Zimra that we're reciting developed from Rashi to the Rif, to the Rambam, to the Rosh, to the Levush, to the Mate Moshe, to Nusach Ashkenaz, to Nusach Sfard, to the Gra, to Germany. There's an amazing tapestry that's being built and that's being weaved and that's being created. So understandably, what's critical about this is that people need to know what's most important and what's less important. So everybody needs to know Ashrei is critical. And that's why the Shulchan Aruch says if you're late, you must say Ashrei. And let's say you have a little bit more time, then you do the Psukei de Zimra of Rashi, the third and the fifth Halaluka. If you have more time, you should say the Psukei de Zimra of the Rif, which is all the Halalukas. And then the more time you have, of course, we want to add Hodu. And when Hodu should be recited, Mizmor Lasoda, Mizmor Shir Chanukas Habayis L'Daven, if that is one's custom in Nusach, and Az Yashir. Az Yashir is critical, and Charas and Bris is critical. So therefore, that is the tapestry that we're building, weaving, developing, what to skip, when to skip, how to skip, what should be recited. Let's just appreciate that it's not just Psukei de Zimra just fell and it just exists and a vacuum was put together by one person. It's not true. That's false, and that's really what the Sefer, the Siddur, making the Siddur tries to do, to allow readers and Klal Yisrael to appreciate the complexity, the development, and the process of the Siddur and its building blocks.
You mentioned the Gra. The Gra doesn't say a lot of things, doesn't hold of a lot of things, especially all these additions. So Mizmor Shir, not. Now, do we know who or when Mizmor Shir and some of these other parts, later parts of Psukei de Zimra were added?
Yeah, so there's certainly indication, and if you take a look in the Siddur, I have certainly many dates and suggestions as to when they did make their way in. But if you look at certainly the Siddurim of the Rishonim, you're not going to find this as much. Now, the Rambam does refer to Az Yashir. So certainly that does exist. But slowly over time, these tefillos began to become more accepted and added and placed and made more prominent. Mizmor Shir Chanukas Abayis David is very significant in many kilos. And again, the Siddur Agra and Talmidei Agra did not think they were as important. So Mizmor Lasoda, I would say Az Yashir gained more stronger acceptance in many Siddurim. Mizmor Shir Chanukas Abayis David, as I said, got much less of a prominent placement. If you take a look in Likutei Marech, which is a wonderful, wonderful sefer, who organizes a lot of the Siddur and puts down a lot of these sodas to Siddur, Tzlosad Avram, in the Hasidic world, they very much organize and place the tapestry of years, dates, timelines, and when specifically they were added.
Yeah, it's Tzlosad Avram. Masada of Cook reprinted. It's not around anymore. They only did part of it. So I think we may mention that the last time, the importance of it. So
there are different editions of the Tzlosad Avram. There are 3 or 4 today. Extraordinarily important work in the Siddur. Very, very significant work, and a lot of material there in halacha, Kabbalah, history. Very, very significant.
Yeah, that's one of the important ones if you can get a hold of it. I know, as a parenthesis here, as an aside, is that like one of the main things if someone was interested in learning on their own, the sources? I mean, that's one of the main ones. Is there other like ones that you would really recommend, like something to pick up?
There's several. I mean, to me, what was very, very critical was the Otzar Tfilas, and that's been reprinted in the 2-volume. Otzar Tfilas is an awesome work. It includes 10 different perushim. If you're interested in the history of the Siddur, the perush and the commentary there, Tikkun Tefillah, is extraordinary, with enormous amount of material. Rabbi Yaakov Emden's Siddur, the Beis Yaakov, has an enormous amount of material. Rabbi Zalman Ber's Siddur, Avodas Yisrael, is extraordinary in terms of its impact and import. In the Hasidic world, yes, the Tzlosad Avram is critical. The Munkacher in his Shar Yisachar is awesome and very, very important. So there's so many influences that we have. If you're looking Hasidish, if you're looking Kabbalah, if you're looking in Germany, if you're looking for Daikanos, if you're looking for Kabbalah, there's a lot. But those Siddur, if somebody's interested in researching the Siddur and trying to get a broad picture, those Siddur are critical. Those are the Siddur that I use a lot. And I hope the making the Siddur will help a lot of people with this. And Baruch Hashem, I think we're seeing that. So we're very grateful and humbled.
For sure, and now we'll link to the making of the Siddur in the show notes, and that for sure you should pick that up. But I mean, if someone wants to go like to primary sources, okay. Yeah. What about Sukkot Zimra of Shabbos? So I know we said we're working our way through, but instead of, I think it makes more sense to discuss that here rather than like end and then come back to Shabbos. Shabbos Sukkot Zimra is a little different. So what about that?
Yeah, I'll add a footnote to that. Obviously, the structure and the skeleton and the template is identical, with additional mizmorim. And the reason for that is Shabbos is a Yom Menucha. And Shabbos, we're not as rushed. Shabbos, we have more time to be contemplative, to be thoughtful, to be pensive. Kabbalah Shabbos has a lot to do with that also, that there's more time to meditate and to think. And therefore, we're given more time to recite Psukei de Zimra and to be Mishabech HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There's an awesome comment by Maimar Muskar, the Mishnah Berurah brings from the Magen Avram, that Psukei de Zimra should take a person daily a half an hour, roughly kichatzi shah. So it's important to be aware of what they thought in terms of the length of time. Psukei de Zimra on Shabbos, you have more time to thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to praise HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's probably the reason why Don Olam and Yigdal also were focused on Zmiris as well on Shabbos, and the Vilna Gaon says it's only on Yom Tov. When there's more time, there's more energy, and certainly the time and the space and the point and the calendar also plays to that. The Kedusha Shabbos, Menucha Shabbos, Oneg Shabbos, Shabbos being a day of Yom Shekulo Shabbos, of Malchus Shamayim, certainly speaks to our ability to be able to tap into the Bari Olam more. That has to do with the Zmiros of Shabbos, it has to do with Kabbalah Shabbos, and therefore it has to do with Psukei de Zimra as well. It's an opportunity to be able to engage and to connect and to tap in more into that. There's really not enough time to talk about it, but I encourage people to take a look. Nishmas is a something we could have a whole podcast about, Nachi. And there's an enormous amount of material. Who the author of Nishmas is something that many historians enjoy researching, talking about. I don't think necessarily this is the time and place, but the authorship of Nishmas is a shir in and of itself.
Yeah, I'm sure you've given shiurim on Nishmas, but I do think it's important for you to emphasize the importance of Nishmas, and some of the poskim say that even takes precedence.
Yeah, so Nishmas is critical, and poskim do say that. The first thing that people should be aware of is Nishmas's introduction, initiation, is actually not the Siddur. It's really on Pesach, right? That's the Mishnah, and the Gemara tells at the end of Mesachas Pesachim and Arvei Pesachim, that's called Birchas Hashir. So in Shas and Chazal, Nishmas is referred to as Birchas Hashir, and that was recited Leil HaSeder on the fourth coast. That's its prominent. It then made itself into the Siddur on Shabbos. And we find it with other tefillos as well. If we have time, we could talk about this in Aleinu. But Nishmas is critical, so much so that, as you accurately point out, the post can point out that if you only have significant and certain amount of time, Nishmas is key and it's critical. It's the introduction to the end of Psukei D'Zimra of Shabbos, and therefore it introduces us to Yishtabach. Yishtabach, by the way, also has a source in Shas. That's Birchas Hashir. That was also recited Leil HaSeder. And those two brachos together, Nishmas and Birchas Hashir and Yishtabach, really found their place centrally and prominently, and their initiation Leil HaSeder at the Seder in the Haggadah, and they transferred to Psukei D'Zimra on Shabbos because of their beauty, because of their importance, because they're prominent. So it has a place of Shas. So certainly it's Tanaitic or Amoraic in terms of its authorship. Can we pin it to one person? So certainly in Taras HaNigla, and certainly in terms of what we have in the basic primary sources in rabbinic literature, the indication is that it was authored by Anshe Knesset Zagdola, if we want to call it that, or if it was written by Chazal, whoever that individual, whoever that person was. But there's no Tana or no Amora that we could certainly pin Yishtabach, Nishmas, and Birchas Hashir to.
And that gets added in early. So you see how, and now that we're getting up to Birchas Kriya Shema, things are, some things, as you say, are much earlier. Some things are, the skeleton is there, and then things are added in. So you kind of see the moving parts and when things are added. And like you're saying, anyone could always pick up there's a couple of different really nice editions of Siddur HaGra. So you can pick that up today and see, that's where you really could see the Gra delete to take things out. And the Nusach HaGra people don't say that. They just don't say certain
and this
things.
is where I guess we could say it gets more controversial and complicated. There's a certain very sacrosanct element to the Siddur, and certainly we're all familiar. The first thing that Rav Hirsch called out was when the reformers changed the Siddur, tinkered with the Siddur. But mitzad sheni, we also have to be familiar that there was development of the Siddur. The Magen Avram, who was the Achron, who probably quoted the Arizal and the Gra the most, and who brought Kabbalah into the Siddur. That means before the Magen Avram and before the Mekubalim Mitzvahs in the 1500s, the standardized tefillos did not include what the Mekubalim brought in. So certainly there is development and there is addition. The question becomes who could add and who has the right to add and who has the power, the authority to be able to make those changes. That's where it gets a little bit more complicated, and when somebody who doesn't have authority, somebody doesn't have the koach, the power, that is where we get into more difficult challenges in terms of what and when and who could add.
Now it's time to turn to Birchas Kriya Shema before we even get to Kriya Shema, starting with Baruch Hu and walking our way through Birchas Kriya Shema.
Yeah, so Birchas Kriya Shema, so in light of our discussion regarding Birchas HaShachar, very much is complements Birchas HaShachar, because again, these are brachos found in the Gemara's Maseches Brachos, Ma'av Ravim, Avarabba, Avas Olam, those different nuschos. It's interesting to note that in the poskim you already find that throughout the course of the day that there are 7 brachos that we make. We make 2 brachos before and 2 brachos after Mariv, Kriya Shema, the Birchas Kriya Shema, and the morning of bracha, 2 brachos before and 1 bracha after. For a total of 7 brachos in the poskim is saying Sheva b'yom hilal ticha. We praise HaKadosh Baruch Hu 7 times during the day, and therefore the Birchas Kriya Shema that we recite in Shacharis and in Marav complement those 7. That's the totality of the Birchas Kriya Shema that we recite, and again enacted, ordained, instituted, established, executed by the Anshe Knesset Gedola. Now, I will note and will point out that there's certainly a big discussion on halacha. This is more for a shir. These are not what we call classically Birchas HaMitzvah. We don't say Asher Kiddushanu b'mitzvos v'tzivanu al mitzvos Kriya Shema. Why? You could take a look in the Rishonim. There's a Chuvas Arash and other. There's a Rashba, all talking about why we don't do that. These are brachos that are made in order to give praise to HaKadosh Baruch Hu prior to Kriya Shema. But they're not brachos on Kriya Shema per se. And therefore, those are the Berachos Kriyishma. But again, Berachos Kriyishma are critical, and they go back a long, long time. The Tshuvas Agonim then maybe even indicate that they were recited in Bayis Rishon. Certainly in Bayis Sheni, there's a very clear indication that the Berachos Kriyishma are being recited. So therefore, individuals need to be aware, familiar, and powerfully aware, and that the Berachos Kriyishma have significant teeth and weight to them, and are ancient, certainly in that regard. And they prepare us for Kriyishma, and they conclude Kriyishma, and those are the sandwiched before and after Kriyishma.
So our whole structure from Baruch Hu until we get to actual Kriyishma, all the brachas, everything there that we say there, when is that from?
Anshe Knesset Agdola. Those are all found in Shas. If you look at the Gemara's Maseches Brachas, you'll see very clearly those brachas articulated in terms of nusach. There are differences in nusach Ashkenaz and nusach Sfarad, Ava Rabba, or Avas Olam, as you're familiar with. But nonetheless, those brachas, the skeleton, the template of those brachas, whether it's the actual word or not, goes back that long. And of course, if you look in the earliest Siddurim, the Siddur of Amram, certainly the Machzor Vitri, the Seder Tefillah of the Rambam, the Abu Draham, and all of the early Rishon, the Rokeach, then Siddur of Chachmei Ashkenaz, Berachos Kriyishma are all well-sourced, going back for quite some time. As I pointed out, you will find Berachos Kriyishma already in the Gaonim, the Tefillas of the Gaonim, the Siddur of the Gaonim, but it's all because they're already found in Parak Me'emasai, the first parak of Maseches Brachas.
Now let's turn to Kriyishma itself. I think everyone takes it as accepted that we say Shema, Baruch Shem, followed by V'ahavta, V'haya, V'yamer. But if you look in the Torah, there's no such order in the Torah that actually says that all in a row. So how did we get in? This is the structure of our daily Kriyishma.
Good question. So the first thing that needs to be pointed out is that Kriyishma, like we refer to it as Tefillah, but it's not Tefillah. Kriyishma are psukim in the Torah. Tefillah means Shemona Esrei. Kriyishma is very, very disparate, separate, and it stands on its own. It's unique. It happens to be that we incorporated Kriyishma into Tefillah, but it's not Tefillah. We are not beseeching. We are not requesting. Kriyishma is statements of truths. They're statements of God's oneness. They're statements of what a Kadosh Baruch Hu is, what a Kadosh Baruch Hu prize. They're statements of our love for a Kadosh Baruch Hu, our care for a Kadosh Baruch Hu. They're statements of Hayim Shema about Schar V'Onesh. Vayomer, of course, is all about Yitzias Mitzrayim, Zechiras Yitzias Mitzrayim, and Tzitzis and Tefillin, etc., etc., etc. So the Mishnayos already tells us in the first parak of Maseches Brachos that this is the order because it's going in order of primacy. We start by being miyached Hashem. God is one. And that's what Shema is about. That's what V'ahavta is about. It's the Ikar Shebe'ikarim. It's the most basic tenets and truths of who we are, what we're about, and what we stand for. Then we get to V'hayim Shmo, which is, the Schar V'Onesh, the rules, the do's, the don'ts, the reward, the punishment. And then ultimately, Vayomer is the lowest, quote unquote, in the totem pole because it only addresses specific mitzvos and mitzvos that are unique to the day, not mitzvos that are unique to the evening. So therefore, the structure of Kriya Shema is in terms of its hierarchy, in terms of importance. That's really what it's about. So you're correct. It's found in Parshas Veschanan, Ekev, but it's not in the Seder that it's found in Tanakh, in the Torah, in Psukim, in Sefer Dvarim, but it's found in terms of order of primacy. So Kriya Shema is critical. When a person is saying Kriya Shema, it's fulfilling a biblical mitzvah of B'shach b'chav v'kumecha. That's what we say in the first and second chapters. We are required by Torah law to say Shema in the morning and Shema in the afternoon. The question becomes, what's the Raisa, what's the Rabbanan? Again, that's a topic for a Shir, Shagas Aryeh. I talk about it in the Sefer quite a bit in terms of its Pasuk Rishon, if it's Perek Rishon, if it's Perek Sheni, all three Prakim. But that really speaks to what Kriya Shema is. One of the more important elements of Kriya Shema actually is the second Pasuk, Baruch Shem K'von Malchus Ha'olam V'Oed. Because if you look at the Torah, you're not going to find that pasuk. It's not a pasuk. It doesn't exist. So why are you saying Baruch Shem K'von Malchus Ha'olam V'Oed right after Shema Yisrael? Any scholar who's going to look, or any layman who's going to look, you look in the Concordance, you look through all of Tanakh, you're not going to find that. You are going to find it in a Gemara. It's a Gemara Meseches Pesachim Daf Nun Vav, if I recall correctly, Nun Vav and Beis and Nun Zayin. It's part of a dialogue between Yaakov and his sons. We're holding Dafka and Parshas Hashavua, Parshas Vayechi. Yaakov Sof Yamav, at the end of his life, he wanted to bless his children, and he wanted Bikesh Yaakov Legalos Saketz. Yaakov wanted to reveal the end of days, Moshe Mashiach, Rashi, Ramban, etc. And he was wondering, were his children or his sons prepared for this? Were they really holding on the level? And he was suspect that maybe they weren't. And they all respond and say, no, Tati, Abba, Daddy, Yaakov Avinu, Shema, Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. And as soon as Yaakov hears that, the Gemara says that Yaakov responds and says, Baruch Shem Kivod Malchus Elover, the name of Kadosh Baruch Hu should be blessed forever and forever and forever. So the Gemara says, well, what do we do now? We're stuck. On the one hand, Baruch Shem Kivod Malchus Elover is not a pasuk in the Torah. Moshe didn't say it, so how could we include it into Shema? On the other hand, Yaakov said it. How could we not recite it? So the Gemara concludes and says you should say it b'nemru b'chshay. Say it silently in an undertone. And that's the reason that we recite Baruch Shem Kavod Malchus Elover in an undertone, as based upon the Psak of the Gemara, and it's formalized, of course, the Rambam, Shulchan Aruch, Beis Yosef, Tur, that Baruch Shem Kavod Malchus Elover should be recited in an undertone. Those are the words of Yaakov Avinu. As the Medrash and as the Gemara points out, they're not the words of Moshe, they're not found in the Torah, but we piggyback it after Shema Yisrael, it's juxtaposed to Shema Yisrael, simply because of the fact that that was the critical dialogue that took place between Yaakov and his sons. Not for now, Nachi, but for another time we'll talk about there are times in the year that we say Baruch Shem Kavod Malchus Elover out loud, and that is a major topic of discussion. Tishrei, Yom Kippur, Baruch Shem, we say that throughout the day of Yom Kippur out loud. There are other times, at Ne'ilah we say it out loud, the Tosfos speaks about it, Rishonim speak about it, but essentially, when we recite Shema 3 times a day, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchus Elover is recited in an undertone, and please, everybody should be aware, it's not in the Torah. It's not a pasuk in the Torah. It's based upon this medrash, and are the words of Yaakov Avinu.
To end this first episode, I think we should just finish off with V'yatziv through Tzor Yisrael. So before Shemon Esrei, and then we'll pick up episode 2. We'll start with Shemon Esrei with, as you say, Tefillah.
Yeah, absolutely. So we conclude with the ending of Birchas Kriya Shema and the brachos after, Emes V'Emunah in the evening, Emes V'Yatziv in the morning. And again, those are Talmudically enacted. Those are found early. Again, Anshe Knesset Gedolah, Shas, Chazal, and those tefillos ultimately were more concretized by Rabbi Amram Gon, the first siddur that we're aware of, the siddur of Reb Sadi Gon, the second most prominent siddur that we're aware of. Then the Machzor Vitri expands, elaborates, and the same thing is true with the Rambam. So those are all found in the earliest of Siddurim, critically important. Then we conclude, of course, with the bracha, Baruch Hashem Goal Yisrael. That's also a bracha min ha-Talmud, and that's what we refer to, the Gemara in Brachos, Daf Daled, we're someh geula l'tefillah. We conclude Kriya Shema by connecting geula, the redemption, the previous redemption from Tzias Mitzrayim, to Tefillah. And again, obviously there shouldn't be any speaking between the two because of the importance of being somech gulu l'tefillah. Tefillah at night and Marav doesn't have that same significance in terms of being somech gulu l'tefillah. That's why we have Hashkivenu, Baruch Hashem le'olam amen v'amen, if we have time to talk about that in the next episode. But that brings us really, as you pointed out accurately, correctly, from Birchas Kriya Shema in terms of section stop number 1, section number 2 being Psukei de Zimra, section number 3 being Birchas Kriya Shema and Kriya Shema, as we climb the ladder, moving from Olam Hazeh to the world of the cosmos, to the world of the angels. So we've gotten ourselves through the first 3 dargas, and now we've prepared ourselves mentally, physically, and with our avodah shablev, with our heart, to be able to be omed l'fnei Melech, to daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and recite Shemona Esrei.
Thank you very much for joining me for this first episode about the making of the Siddur, working through each part. And I, as I stated on the episode, I will link to that first episode, the overarching one that we did, and I'll also link to the book, The Making of the Siddur, for those interested, and looking forward to the next episode.
Thank you.